Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. Lots and lots of love to each and every one of you, and I hope you're doing remarkably well today. So before we get started with tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Susan, although people often call me Sue for short, and I'm from Seattle. And my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1995, when I was about 28 years old at the time. I grew up with both my parents and my two younger sisters in a three-storey Tudor-style home with steeply pitched grey gable roofs. On the first floor of our home, the exterior wall is presented in a charming red brick format, but on the next two levels the walls are painted white and decorated with dark exposed wooden beams, so typically seen in a quintessential Tudor home. My story begins when I was working as a young journalist for a local paper, as I was so passionate about writing and reporting, and I was enjoying my job so very much, until invariably things began to change for me in the workplace quite dramatically. I was experiencing some tumultuous challenges with my boss, who kept trying to censor my reporting and sometimes completely alter or distort my stories, which would invariably be very disturbing and unsettling for me. I became increasingly frustrated because I wanted to report what I had witnessed and observed on a scene worthy of news reporting. My boss had very stringent ideas and remarkably strict rules about what I could say and what I couldn't say. It was like I was expected to spoon-feed the public, as they clearly weren't big enough to handle the facts of a case, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. I wanted to write from my heart with eloquence, depth and empathy. But such brutal honesty was being actively discouraged by my boss. This invariably would lead to vocal disputes in the office, where I would express my extreme outrage at all this blatant censorship, which I felt was morally wrong and reprehensible. You can't suppress the truth like that or manipulate it to fit an agenda, but clearly my boss could. This slanted, warped perspective of things made no sense to me at all. Was not being a reporter about true factual commentary without bias and unwarranted prejudice, not to mention bigoted concealment? But it would seem I was wrong. I began to feel like a caged bird with my wings clipped, my hands cuffed, and my lips silenced, because I could not be the authentic reporter I aspired to and yearned to become. One day when I was hoping to receive a promotion at work, I was mortified to discover that my boss had surreptitiously given it to the junior girl in the office who was working under me instead. I approached my boss with questions about this bizarre turn of events. I was told that if I'd been more amenable and obliging, without expressing my disdain about the twisted, warped way things were done in the office, then I would have indeed been promoted. I was literally told more or less by my boss that it was his way or the highway, if you get my drift. I was absolutely incensed that a few reasonable, fair objections that I had raised about the arbitrary censorship of articles which my boss had imposed on my work had set me back on my career path as a journalist, and I was beginning to realise that this business was indeed very cutthroat, very treacherous and tough, and unless you towed the line and did things strictly according to the book, you'd never ever get promoted. It was clear that I needed a thick skin in this line of work, much like a tough rhino hide, because any hope of being creative or reaching for the stars was most certainly discouraged. I felt so enraged, cheated and disappointed that Friday afternoon that I decided to take a drive to an area of national forest, which was an hour's drive outside Seattle, that I knew very well. As a young girl, I'd camped out in these woods on many occasions with my entire family. I was well acquainted with them and knew the general layout of them. Well, at least I thought I did, like the back of my hand, but I was soon to realise how wrong I was about that. I made two very big mistakes on this occasion, and that was failing to tell anyone where I was actually going, and secondly, I only took a bottle of water on my hike with me, and nothing else. On reflection, that is utter and total madness, but I guess I was feeling a little wobbly and out of sorts after failing to receive the promotion that I'd been hoping for. So I suppose my oversight can be forgiven on this occasion. I decided a long walk to work off my increasing anger, dismay and discouragement was well in order. I was not a violent, aggressive person by any manner of means, but I did have very strong feelings about ethics and fairness that stretch back to my early childhood. My strong code of fairness, integrity and justness was actually birthed when I was a very young girl. You see, we lived next door to an elderly lady called Mrs. Van Swine, who decided to give my sisters and I each a bag of sweets. I recall this story so vividly, as if it was only yesterday, and as an adult you may think it's no big deal, but to a child, as I was then, this was a monumental deal for me that impacted my life dramatically and empowered me to see right from wrong from a very early age. The sweet, well-meaning old lady had 3 bags of sweets in her hands. The largest was filled with delectable, delicious-looking candies. The medium-sized one was filled with yummy-looking jellies, and the small bag was a tiny bag of peppermints, and I hated peppermints. As kids, she asked the youngest child to choose first, and naturally my sister Candace chose the big bag of sweets, and she tottered off happily to eat them. Then the second eldest was my sister Ella, and she was given the second choice, and she naturally chose the jellies. So I was left with the peppermints, which I threw away instinctively in a dustbin, feeling very aggrieved and hurt by this situation, on principle. I had been made to feel that as the oldest, I had less worth than my younger siblings, because I had been blatantly discriminated against. Why had the old lady, with her faulty good intentions, not wisely divided the sweets out equally between us into 3 separate bags? Why had she been so discriminatory and prejudiced, clearly giving my younger sister preferential treatment? Her seeming act of generosity was seriously flawed and undermined my view of the world from that point on. I began to believe that the world was not always a fair or agreeable place. I remember telling my mother what had happened, and she was quite disgusted by the old lady's blatant favouritism, but assured me that maybe the old lady had once been the youngest sibling herself and had felt cheated growing up with her older siblings, and always felt that she had a raw deal, receiving her sister's hand-me-downs, which was why she chose to give my younger sister first choice. I thought my mother made a very good point there, and that made some kind of sense to me. But even so, that shameless act of favouritism bothered me all my life. Now, as a journalist, I hated dishonesty of any kind, and it seemed that the profession that I had chosen could be so biased and dishonourable itself, and I was seeing this first-hand. Who knew that writing articles for a local paper could become so complicated and so tarnished? So there I was, driving to the area of National Forest frequented by many hikers and campers, but on this occasion there wasn't a solitary soul around, and it was particularly quiet. I parked my car in an open clearing and put on my walking shoes, and armed with a bottle of water, I ventured into the woods. It was a really glorious day, with the sunshine dancing prettily through the canopy above my head, dappling the rich green forest floor in varying shades of light. The tall statuesque trees that towered up into the heavens like masterful green giants were like old friends to me, and I've always loved the solid strength of those trees and how grounded they make me feel. The woods were filled with Douglas firs, spruces, mountain hemlocks, and the occasional oak, and they were terribly enchanting. As I made my way to a large oak tree, I wrapped my arms around the sturdy tree trunk. It really helped me gain a sense of perspective over everything. I always thought people who hugged trees were seriously loopy, but I promise you there is something to it. When I put my arm around the huge trunk, I felt a massive sense of peace envelop me, and I physically became much more relaxed. I knew this tree incredibly well. It had been around when my grandmother was a little girl, and I could still see her name carved in the bark from when she was only 8 years old. I was astonished to think that the marks were still there, given the growth of the tree over the years, and this masterful, imposing tree had stood in this forest for so very long. I ran my hand across the engraving and marvelled that it was still here, even though it was very worn away. I noticed on one of the upper branches of the tree a little squirrel was perched. He was stuffing his gorgeously fat cheeks with the acorn he was nibbling, and he eyed me curiously. "You don't have to concern yourself with a nasty boss, do you?" I asked the squirrel. I laughed as it continued to watch me through its brown sparkling eyes. I remember thinking to myself how uncomplicated his life was, and that all he needed to do was to concern himself with his next winter stash for his winter hibernation. It was amazing how the natural world has a way of just calming you down and bringing you back to your senses. I realised that in the vast scheme of it all, nothing really mattered. As I continued my hike through the forest, I began to relax significantly, as the exquisite scenery and the beautiful birdsong uplifted me greatly, and I was feeling much more upbeat and positive about the world. After a while I glanced at my watch in amazement, as I realised in my alarm that it was quite late in the afternoon already. But because it was summer it wasn't dark yet, but I knew I should be making tracks back to the car. Where had the time gone to, I wondered? It was as if hours had almost melted into seconds. As I looked around the forest, I suddenly realised I was completely, utterly and hopelessly lost. This had never happened to me before. I knew this wooded area so well, but suddenly the trees, woodland, shrubbery and entire area seemed foreign and unfamiliar to me. The path through the forest ventured to the right and to the left, and I literally had no idea which way to go. I began to feel like a rabbit trapped in a maze. I decided to take a right turning and hoped with all my heart it would lead me back the way I'd initially come. But the more I walked along the course, the less familiar it became, and I realised in horror that I was way off course and that I was really well and truly lost. How on earth had this happened? I thought I knew the wooded area well, but I obviously didn't. Darkness rolled across the valley, and the sounds of crickets, frogs and owls began to welcome in the dusky night, with the early announcement of the bright full moon and a scattering of silvery stars that made their presence known. Much of the bright light was blocked out by the wooded trees, but luckily it still offered ample enough light for me to see my immediate surroundings, but it was too dark for me to even try and find my way out of the woods. I was so angry with myself for entering the woods so unprepared. My father had always taught me to go hiking with 2 days' supply of food and drink, matches, a flashlight, compass and a light blanket, and he told me that way you could be prepared for every emergency situation. But had I listened to him? No, I hadn't. He always warned us about the possibility of getting lost. In my father's youth he'd once been a forest ranger, and he always had one vital rule, which he called Rule Number 1, which was never under any circumstances to ever panic. He believed that anxiety could be your most grievous enemy, and I was certain he was right about that. How often had I heard of stories of people dying out in the woods when they were so close to the exit? I wonder how many allowed panic to unhinge them, causing them to completely lose focus. I could not allow that to happen to me this night. I tried to calm my rising anxiety, as I realised I'd be spending a night out here in the woods, so I set myself up in a little clearing, surrounded by a dense thicket under a tree. I envisaged that it might keep me hidden from a potential predator, and I also retrieved a large piece of timber to use as a makeshift weapon should I need to defend myself. It was a beautiful, peaceful night, and before long I fell fast asleep. I was awoken to a strange noise that sounded like people talking gibberish and engaging in a long, animated conversation of some kind. I opened my eyes ever so slightly to see 3 pairs of vertical brown eyes staring down at me from a vast height of about 8 feet off the ground. Whatever it was that was staring at me, they were very tall, and their eyes exuded a somewhat menacing red eyeshine. I felt so tiny and inconspicuous as these huge giants observed me with a very keen, curious interest. Once I finally fully opened my eyes, they saw that I was awake, and they became quite jubilant. I realised that the conversation that they were engaging in was actually all about me. These critters were very strange, because there were aspects to their biological makeup that was indeed remarkably human, such as the high level of intelligence and discernment that I could comprehend. Yet there was also physical aspects of these creatures that much resembled the great ape, from the overlong arms to the cone-shaped heads, and of course the very fact that the critters were covered in long flowing hair that seemed rather dark in colour, but human-like in texture. The first thing I observed about these critters was how colossal that they actually were, as all 3 creatures were easily over 8 foot tall, 900 pounds, and about 3 foot wide. I observed that these masterful critters were built for speed, power, strength and endurance. I could tell this by the intense muscular definition that was seen in their bodies, which would make the most ardent bodybuilder feel intimidated. I stared up in awe at these ape-like humanoids with a mixture of horror and adulation at the same time. The first thing I thought was that they were going to harm me or kill me, but I soon realised that that was not the case, which immediately calmed me down and was very reassuring. On the contrary, these critters seemed perturbed about my strange presence in the forest, and I believe they were discussing what they should do about me. They seemed concerned and worried about my safety, and seemed to assume some kind of responsibility. I rarely comprehended and ascertained that they definitely knew that I was lost and somehow stranded, and they were definitely desirous to help me in the circumstances, which I thought was utterly extraordinary, and believe me, I knew I could do with all the help that I could get, even if it came from an unlikely source. Once again they began talking in gibberish to each other, and I could sense that there was an argument going on between two of the hairy critters as the voices became raised and more high-pitched, as if they couldn't agree on something. They went on for a very long time, until two of the critters went away, leaving one behind, whom I realised they had posted there to watch over me as some kind of centurion on guard duty. I know it sounds preposterous and ludicrous, but these hairy humanoids made me feel incredibly safe and secure. I was now not so afraid of any predators in the woods, because I knew I was being watched over by these extraordinary creatures, and I knew I was being valiantly guarded, and that enabled me to drift into a comfortable sleep. I woke up to find one of the creatures poking me with a finger and handing me a pile of berries and a couple of apples, which he had placed in a hollowed-out piece of bark, which was shaped like a bowl. I ate gratefully as I suddenly realised how hungry and thirsty I was, and I was grateful to be able to moisten my mouth with the juices from the fruit. After drifting off into a deep sleep again, I was awoken to the sound of the hairy humanoid or centurion on guard duty, who was watching over me carefully, and he was unleashing the most horrifying growl. I woke up with a start, feeling very rattled, and my hair stood on end in terror because the sound was so intimidating and alarming. I've never heard a sound like that before. And then I saw it. It was a very big, impressive-looking mountain lion that had been sniffing around me with a very keen interest. I know that sightings of these creatures are not common and are rare in this part of the world, so it was typical that this creature was sniffing around me at this time of the night, and he was interested in me too. Talk about luck. The large hairy humanoid lunged towards the mountain lion with a very aggressive growl, curling back his lips, and the mountain lion, with a look of terror on his face, darted away as fast as he could, letting out a little whimper. I realised that the creature watching over me and his kind were, without question, kings of the forest. I think they could so easily have taken down a bear without breaking a sweat. It would seem there wasn't an animal out there that wasn't intimidated by them. Why were they looking out for me? I couldn't imagine, but I knew that if they hadn't protected me that night, things could have turned out remarkably differently. The following morning I awoke to the sun filtering through the trees, but looking around the forest I had no idea where I actually was. I was as lost and confused as to my whereabouts as I had indeed been the day before, but help came my way because the hairy critter who'd been guarding me during the night beckoned for me to follow him. He obviously knew I was lost, and he was trying to help me find my way out of the woods. To my amazement, he guided me to the open clearing where my car was actually parked, which I think he assumed was mine. I mean, I ask you, how clever is that? He guided me through such a quick route that within 30 minutes I was back at my car. I couldn't believe the intelligence of this extraordinary creature, and how they'd looked out for me in my moments of greatest vulnerability, and how they'd kept me safe and led me out of the woods the following morning, back to safety. I was amazed by what a gentleman the centurion actually was, because I kid you not, this huge hairy humanoid actually stood there waiting for me to drive off in my car, to satisfy himself that I was indeed going to be fine. When I drove away, I realised how remarkably lucky I was to encounter such a fabulous, unusual and extraordinary creature. But for many years I wondered what these strange hairy humanoids actually were that I encountered in the woods that day. I never told anyone about the strange encounter, because working as a journalist you cannot believe how cynical, sceptical and scoffing a team of journalists can be. They're the most cynical, I can tell you that. If I'd shared my peculiar story with them, I doubt they would have ever respected me again. About 3 years after my story, someone actually phoned up our newspaper to report an extraordinary encounter with a hairy humanoid in an area of Washington State Forest. I asked my boss if I could do the report and visit the person in question who had experienced this extraordinary encounter. My boss said to me, "What balderdash! I've never heard such complete and utter hogwash in my entire life. As if anyone with half a brain is going to believe such a bizarre story and such spurious, outlandish claims. What utter nonsense!" "How do you know he's not telling the truth?" I protested. "Why would he make something like this up? What has he got to gain from being humiliated and ridiculed by people like us, especially reporters?" "Because, Susan, some people just want a moment in their lives to be the centre of attention, with their story splashed all over the papers. I'm surprised you haven't figured that out already. It's shameless the lengths people will go to just for a spot of fame." "But, sir, supposing the story is actually true?" "Susan, I would think that a girl like you would be a lot more discerning than this, of course. You do disappoint me. Of course it's not true. Give me a break. A humanoid ape running around our forests. Oh, I've heard everything now. Next it'll be a Tyrannosaurus was seen dancing in the car park. And then there was a Platysaurus basking himself in the sun on the local beach. Oh, I mean, really, Susan, you do surprise me. You should use your common sense, girl, and get your head straightened out of the clouds." You see what I mean by a biased boss, who simply refuses to believe anything that does not fit in his perimeter of what he would deem to be an acceptable truth, because he simply cannot conceive or think out of the box like your listeners clearly can. I'm glad to tell you that after a few years of working for that miserable old sod, I left him to work for a health magazine instead, and thankfully my work no longer is censored. However, it is somewhat limited to reports on health, which can be sometimes a little monotonous. I was to find out years later that those creatures that I encountered in the woods were Bigfoots, and I feel so privileged and blessed to have had an encounter. So there you are. That's my story. Susan, I just want to thank you so very much for that incredible encounter. It was absolutely fascinating. And I do believe that there are hairy critters out there, such as Bigfoots, that really do take care of people that are in distress. Yes, you do get the ugly ones, you get the hostile ones, you get the aggressive ones that are very dangerous to be around, but you also get the Bigfoots that really care about humanity. And talking about being a journalist as you are, I do agree that there is so much censorship going on, so much covering going on, that they don't want us to know this and they don't want us to know that, because they think we're all just unable to cope with the truth, and that's ridiculous. Until next time, goodbye and good night.